Broadcast.
I can hear. If you close the door, I can hear them.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good evening. We're so happy to have you. I'm Jackie Schicker, and I'm from Greenlight Bookstore, and we're super delighted this evening that you've joined us for our online event. We're excited to host and welcome our online event series with Squawkin Sports, hosted by Patrick Sauer and sometimes David Roth. For this installment, they'll be chatting with Todd Snyder about his new book, Bundini, Don't Believe the Hype. So you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Patrick and tonight's featured author Todd for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're super grateful for your support and for the chance to make conversation and connection happen. Now, just a couple of housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and that you can check out your fellow attendees at the bottom of your Zoom screen, exactly where depends on your device. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. It looks like two little speech balloons at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be pulling questions from there this evening. We are recording tonight's event, so look out for the video on our YouTube channel later on. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Bundini, is on sale, available from Greenlight Bookstore. We're excited to be able to offer actual shopping in person now in both of our locations from 12 p.m. to 6 p.m., Tuesday through Saturday. And you can purchase Todd's books and many others on our site, or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store, or for shipping anywhere else in the U.S. If you care about supporting the careers of authors like Todd and the ongoing existence of indie bookstores like us, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. So our host for this evening is Patrick Sauer. Patrick has written for many large publications you've heard of, and even more small ones that no longer exist. He's a founding member of the Billings, Montana to Brooklyn sports writing pipeline. He'll be speaking this evening with our featured author, Todd Snyder. Todd is a son of a West Virginia boxing trainer and the author of 12 Rounds in Lowe's Gym, Boxing and Manhood in Appalachia. He holds a BA and MA in English from Marshall University and a PhD in Rhetoric and Composition from Ohio University. He's an associate professor of rhetoric and writing at Siena College. He lives in Albany, New York. His new book, Bundini, digs deep into Drew Bundini Brown's expansive story, revealing not only how he became Muhammad Ali's hype man, but also as boxing's greatest motivator, a model for others who seek to inspire in any endeavor. So Patrick and Todd, please take it away.
Thank you. Somebody asked in the Q&A they need the link. Can you post that link for the Zoom link? The recording doesn't exist quite yet. Or do you mean the link to this event? I wasn't sure, but I put the link in there.
I will. Great.
Thank you.
I will also add that in. Thank you for that heads up.
So I wanted to, first I want to say that David is in the woods of Maine. I tried to get him to go to Lewiston, for symbiosis, but apparently he wants to enjoy his vacation.
It would have been fitting though.
It would have been nice. I want to start before the book with your biography, because that's pretty interesting in and of itself. Son of a coal miner, boxing trainer. So tell the good folks about your upbringing.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. I do have a unique sort of angle to arriving to this particular research project. I grew up in a really small town in West Virginia, and the name of the town was Cowan, West Virginia. It was a small coal mining town. And I grew up in a family of coal miners, and that's sort of that's the trade back in my homeland. My father was a coal miner. His father was a coal miner. Pretty much every man in my family either worked in the timber industry or in the coal mines, which is pretty tough manual labor work, as I'm sure you know. But my dad was a coal miner by day and a boxing trainer by night. And he founded this small little community center in Callan called Lowe's Gym. And he trained mostly amateur fighters. It was sort of a community outreach. It was a very poor part of Appalachia. And it was sort of a catch net for kids who didn't play high school sports, or maybe kids who had dropped out of school altogether. And my father trained fighters as sort of a community outreach. And he had some professionals, but mostly amateurs. So boxing has been my entire life. I grew up in the gym, with my dad as a young person. I boxed when I was in high school. When I got a little older and went off to college, I worked corners with my father. I probably worked hundreds of amateur boxing matches. So I grew up knowing what it's like to be in training camp. I grew up knowing what it's like to be in the corner, working corners for fighters. So I've always been fascinated by trainers. I've always been fascinated by that camaraderie of being in training camps. So my background is sort of unique in the sense that, boxing has been a big part of my life. Now, the flip side of the coin is that I'm an English professor at Siena College. Not a traditional career path for a kid where I'm from. I grew up in a small trailer park. Willoughby Trailer Park was the name of it. Not a lot of college professors coming out of there. To be honest, the sort of saving grace for me as a kid was hip hop. It was like a literacy sponsor. They would make a Langston Hughes reference in a rap song, so I had to go check out Langston Hughes. And in a place where writing wasn't a very manly thing to do, hip hop made writing cool. Like Rakim made metaphor and simile cool to me as a young man. And I grew up in the 80s, so there were kids even in West Virginia digging hip hop, and we had Young TV Raps. So we were somewhat.
I was in Montana at the same time.
Yeah,
same thing, same deal.
And it's funny because I'll have colleagues say to me, "How did you get into hip hop in West Virginia?" Well, there's hip hop in Japan. It can make it from New York to West Virginia. There's only one state in between. So, it made its way to the hollers of West Virginia too. So the other side of that is I go to college, dreams of becoming a writer, and I teach courses on hip hop culture now. Now, what brought me to Bundini was that I grew up the son of a boxing trainer who loves hip hop. And in some ways, Drew Bundini Brown, I think, has a foot in both the boxing world and also, I would say, sort of that era right before hip hop becomes a thing in the late 1970s. Yeah. Bundini was a part of those Shaft movies and the blaxploitation films, and he was the street poet in Ali's corner. Part of what I loved about Ali were the rhymes: float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. So the reason this project was so attractive to me was I'm fascinated by boxing trainers. I love hip hop. Who better to study than Drew Bundini Brown? He's a little bit of both. He's a rapper. He's a boxing trainer. He exists in both worlds.
And he's also, what I think is really great about your book is that you don't try to define him necessarily, because he's kind of undefinable. And even,
absolutely.
I mean, he's sort of behind the scenes of all of it. But yeah, you generally, people say, the godfathers of hip hop are, James Brown, Muhammad Ali, and then Iceberg Slim, guys like that. But Bundini's right there also, and he's mystical in some ways, but also a bullshitter completely. Like, it's such an interesting character, and it fits. In those two worlds, he is the Venn diagram for a lot of that stuff.
Absolutely, I couldn't have said it better myself, Patrick. He is the Venn diagram. He's in both worlds, and he is a very hard person to define. Because some people have called him an assistant trainer, which is true. He was in training camp every day with Muhammad Ali, with Sugar Ray Robinson, the guys he worked with. But he wasn't necessarily, like Angelo Dundee. He wasn't a X's and O's boxing trainer. Bundini never boxed. He wasn't necessarily an athletic guy either. He was a spirit coach, some people say. Some call him like a sports psychologist, a motivational speaker. The hype man term gets thrown around with some audiences. He's just a great guy to write about. For a writer, he's a dream subject. He's a dream protagonist because he's almost, it's almost impossible to define him. He's an enigma.
And also, I was thinking of, when I was reading the book, the Key and Peele had the Obama translator. Do you know that character? Like
Yeah.
the anger, his id basically.
Yeah.
But this wasn't that either, because Ali, it's not like he was an alter ego for Ali to be the Incredible Hulk. You know, it was sort of like one-upsmanship of the same. They almost had sort of a same mind meld on that kind of, on some level of the rhymes and even though they were really opposite people in pretty much every facet.
They were opposites in so many ways, but I remember I was interviewing Thomas Hauser, who was one of Ali's biographers. And Hauser said their imaginations were so similar. And I thought that was a brilliant way of saying it. They just thought the same kind of jokes were funny. They thought about God in the same kind of way, although their religious backgrounds couldn't have been more different. They were similar in more ways than they were different. You know, although they're juxtapositions in some way. They just were, you know, John Ide said, you know, they're maybe Ali's best marriage. They were just a great duo. You know, Kalia Ali called him Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. They just were great buddies, and they got energy from each other. And like all good relationships, they're yin and yang. You know, they give each other what the other one doesn't have, maybe. So
it's interesting too, but you also have Howard Bingham in there.
Yeah,
His other close. He had these two close friends, confidants-ish, that he took different things from, who didn't have really, you know, neither of them were trainers. They were in the sort of circle, but they both kind of gave him something.
The two most famous sports entourages ever are Sugar Ray Robinson's entourage. You got to remember, Sugar Ray had a barber in his corner for fights who fixed his hair in between rounds. I mean,
so good.
Sugar Ray had a golf instructor. And Bundini sort of played hype man to Sugar Ray too. He was his spirit coach, his motivator. So Sugar Ray Robinson really was the fighter who started the idea of an entourage. It comes from Sugar Ray. And Bundini is a part of that for 7 consecutive years. Then Ali sort of forms what becomes the even biggest, you know, greatest entourage ever in boxing history, with Angelo and Freddie Pacheco, the fight doctor, and Howard, who you're referring to, and Captain Sam, and Blood Muhammad, all these guys who each gave Ali something, you know, a little different. And Bundini was definitely the street poet of the group, the spirit coach of the group. They were spokes in a wheel. They had their own role, their own job. And you're right, they were very different men, a part of that entourage.
And he definitely had, he had an ego, but everyone has an ego on that kind of stage. But Bundini didn't need to push himself, in any way past what Ali wanted. It also seemed like he kind of knew also when to step back, sort of when he was needed. Maybe, you know, Angelo Dundee, you know, said he was crazy. If you try to figure him out, you'll go crazy or whatever.
Yeah, right.
But he was never trying to be more than whatever role he defined for himself.
It's very true. And I'll say this about him. There is a misconception that he was a jokester, that it was all like, you know, he was like a cheerleader. That is absolutely not the case. He was a very serious guy. And yeah, he did have a sense of humor. But in a lot of ways, he was a very spiritual man. And him and Ali did a lot of praying together.
He cried all the time.
Super emotional. And I talked to Angelo Dundee's son, and he said, the only thing that my dad ever really quarreled with Bundini about was the crying, because Bundini would cry at the drop of a hat. And Angelo was an old school tough guy, Italian guy. It was like, you know, you don't cry in a boxing gym, you know. And Bundini said a real man can cry, you know, because a real man is in touch with what's on the inside. And he instilled that in Ali, who was an emotional guy too in some ways.
Tell us a little bit about, there's so many good things to cover in his life, but tell us a little bit about his brief time in the Navy, and then his marriage, which was way ahead of its time, and would be like, he would be a social media star now, you know. Tell us a little bit about the Navy, how that, you know, where he got his name from, and then his crazy marriage.
To really get a handle on who this guy is, you have to go back to his childhood, because so much of his childhood affected the way he viewed the world from that point forward. He grew up in very, very poor circumstances in Sanford, Florida. And at that point in history in Seminole County, it was a very hard place to be a black man. I mean, the KKK, their presence loomed large in Seminole County. And mostly the work that you could get was hard work in the celery fields. I mean, that was at one point the celery capital of the nation. And hard backbreaking work out in the fields. And that's sort of the backdrop to his childhood. His mother leaves him when he's a very young man, I think 5 years old. His father was abusive. His father was an alcoholic, and there was domestic violence in the household. And his mother leaves with his brother. And he lives with his father for a while. Then his father sends him off to live in Sanford with his grandmother. And this is one of my favorite parts of the Bundini story is his father puts him on a Greyhound bus, and he pins a little note to his flannel shirt that says, "Do the best you can for him." And he sends him off to live with his mother. And Bundini lives in a house.
Man, that probably ends up being one of the best things that ever happened to him.
No, it in some ways is the first step into saving his life.
Yeah.
He goes and he lives, and finally he has kids to play with, and he has a little bit of stability in his life, but still the circumstances are bad. Well, the real turning point of his life is when he's 13, the naval base opens up in Sanford. And Bundini was a very tall kid for his age. He had a little mustache, so he looked older than he was. And he went down and he signed up for the Navy at 13 years old, lied about his age. And at that point in the Navy, black men were essentially stewards. They shined shoes, cooked in the kitchen. They didn't actually get a fight. So they took him aboard. He joined the Navy at 13 years old. And that's the journey that takes him around the world. I mean, he joins the Navy, and that's sort of sets him down the path to it.
And you have the detail of him trying to magic marker pubic hair on himself so that
He did, and he did that out of paranoia. And his son told me that became a phrase in the family. He would say, "Pin up." That meant be a man. So he had a phrase for
whatever works.
I mean, it's a crazy story, but it's true. And he joins the Navy, and this is the part where it really gets strange. Is one of the officers called him the N-word, and he threw the officer over the ship. And that was the end of Bundini's time in the Navy. They kicked him out. And also during the course of this, they find out that he's 15. He's not even 18.
Right,
So
because if he had been 18, he would have been court-martialed, right?
He would have been court-martialed. So to cover themselves, they just sent him packing. You know, it's in the Navy where he gets the nickname Bundini. They're in a port in India, and these girls see him, and they holler at him, and they call him Bundini, Bundini, which roughly translates to lover. And they tease him and call him Bundini Brown, and he keeps the nickname. And he would make up stories as to what it really meant. He's told like 50 versions, but we're going to go off the version he told his family, which is the port in India story. That's the one I went with.
I mean, that's also a good, that's a solid origin story right there. You don't need to mess with that.
Well, what happens after the Navy is he joins the Merchant Marines, and he spends 12 years as a Merchant Marine. And because of that experience, he ends up living in Harlem for a while, where he meets the woman you alluded to earlier, Rhoda Palestine, which
is that name is just.
Yeah, and she was a beautiful woman who was from a family of Russian immigrants who had fled Russia because of the anti-Semitic stuff that was happening at the time. And she was raised an Orthodox Jew, and she was very rebellious and didn't like the rules and didn't like the sort of button-down life. So she sneaks off to the jazz joints with her friends, her high school friends, and she meets Bundini, and they fall in love and they get married at a time, like you said, that a relationship between a black man from Florida and a white Jewish girl from Brighton Beach, New York. That was
this is long before the Lovings couple.
Yeah,
but also they have an interracial marriage, but they also have an open marriage, which that predates the free love by a long time. They're kind of my heroes.
They were unique characters. And Rhoda Palestine, I put some of her writing in the book because I had some of her high school writings, and I had some of her, personal writings to her son, and she was just brilliant, so smart, and read philosophy and was interested in life and poetry and jazz. And you could see why Bundini fell in love with her. She was a beautiful woman, and she was so smart and dynamic, and he was sort of risky and different for her too. And he was a slick talker and a good looking guy. So they were these two hurricanes that fell in love, listening to Billie Holiday, and then jazz joints.
the booze got the boast of them, but
yes,
before that they were they were eating a peach. Like they were not just like sitting at home, you know, drinking and screaming at each other. Like they really lived that New York life and the heyday of, you know, Sugar Ray Robinson's club.
Yeah, they, you know, Drew's son was actually conceived in Sugar Ray's club, you know, after hours. Yeah, that's part of the family history. They let me put that in the book. They lived a wild, kind of crazy New York City life, and they did not care what people thought. They didn't care what, you know, the standards, and, you know, they didn't care what people thought of their relationship. And they have a son, you know, Drew Brown III, and
who was a central figure in the book.
Yeah, you know, he was sort of my connection to his dad, and I got to know him so well, and we became great friends. And he has been a great friend to me as far as letting me into his family and talking about the rough times and the good times and bad. And he held nothing back. He really, I think in some ways it was therapeutic for him to go back and relive some of his life wasn't easy either. You know, being Bundini's son was not easy. And
he had some rough times as well, but we should have also add the first black jet fighter. What's the exact thing he was? I don't want to get it wrong.
Yeah, I mean, he was a Navy fighter pilot, and for the specific plane that he flew, he was the first black pilot on the East Coast. He got his golden wings, and you think that his dad was, you know, someone who was kicked out of the Navy for throwing an officer over the side of a boat. It's an unbelievable story that Bundini's son goes on not only to be in the Navy, but to be a college graduate, to be a college basketball player. Mm-hmm. His son goes on to a successful career as a motivational speaker. He writes a best-selling book in the early 80s. He was you know, the apple didn't fall far from the tree. He was very much like his father, a dynamic talker, very smart, charismatic guy who was raised, it was sort of the best of both worlds. He had the Jewish side, he had the black side, and he thinks of himself as you know, bicultural, not biracial is the term he likes to use. Is a super dynamic guy. And you know what? Bundini was a proud daddy. He loved his son and bragged about his son. And before I ever met him, if you go read all those Ali books, there's always a little part about Bundini bragging about his son. He was a very proud father, despite the fact that him and Rhoda do eventually get divorced and have their problems.
I mean, he certainly, you know, was an absentee father. You know, obviously had a drinking problem, a lot of problems, but it did come through that he was not. He never stopped loving his kids, whether he was doing not even when he was not being the right guy that he should have been. But that comes through as well.
Here's how I would frame it. He was on the roller coaster of all roller coasters. Mm-hmm. When Drew was a little boy, he was off running around with Sugar Ray Robinson. You know, that was his job, is to follow around Sugar Ray and take care of him. And a lot of times, you know, you're away from your family, like any job that takes you away from your family. But with this job, it also came with a lot of temptations, and it came with a lot of perks of being a part of the greatest entourage in boxing. And he definitely succumbed to some of that. With Ali, it was the same thing. You know, he was absent sometimes. He was off doing his thing. But really, you know, they were super close. You know, they were always within a phone call of each other. Their relationship was tight, despite some of the marital problems. And, you know, it's been well documented that Bundini had a drinking problem. Some of that was part of the family friction too.
And he and his wife, they were always sort of in each other's orbits as well. Even after the divorce, doesn't they you know, they owned a bar.
It's so funny because I assumed that when they divorced, that you know late 50s, that relationship stopped. It didn't. You were talking about their relationship. He still stayed over all the time. He was still there all the time, and it's not conventional. Let's just say it that way. They were very much a part of each other's world. And when Bundini opens up a club in the 70s called Bundini's World, Rhoda works at Bundini's World with her ex-husband, and she helps keep the books. So yeah, they were divorced, but they were never really that separated either. Once again, he's hard to pin down.
Did he consider himself Jewish? You know, because I know he called himself a black Jew, but did he?
Yep.
Did he go to temple? I mean, was that an actual part of his existence, or was it just?
Let me explain that, because I think that's one of the most misrepresented things that I found in my early research. He married Rhoda, and they raised their son Jewish. He had a bar mitzvah. He spent time in Israel in a kibbutz. So yeah, he did sort of the way he thought of it is, my son's Jewish, I'm Jewish too. So he wore the Star of David necklace, and you know, if my son is Jewish, then that means I'm Jewish. And he took part in the ceremonies at the bar mitzvah, and he took part in all that stuff with his son. Now, Bundini wasn't your Orthodox Jew. He wasn't like Rhoda's family, obviously. Bundini's concept of God was very different.
Shorty.
Shorty is what he called him, and he said that's because God's for the little guy. He's out for the least, the underdog, and that was sort of his personal concept of God. And it didn't, for Bundini, it didn't feel like a contradiction that Ali was a Muslim, his son was a Jewish man. Whatever, you know, it's God, it's Shorty, it's one God, and he loved going to religious ceremonies. He would take his son to all different kinds of religious institutions and take part. He never really was a traditional Jewish man, but he would tell people, you know, I'm a black Jew, my son's Jewish, I'm Jewish too. You know, that's how he would tell it to reporters.
And that, you know, you think about sort of the Louis Farrakhan era of the Nation of Islam.
Yeah.
Not the friendliest to the Jews, I think would be fair to say.
Well documented, sure.
But that didn't seem to ever pop up much with, maybe because Ali didn't care, but it didn't ever seem to, when Ali was at, you know, when he was at his most tied to the Nation of Islam, that didn't seem to be an issue, or were there things that just went unsaid on that kind of deal? Because they did kind of try to cheat him out of his float like a butterfly.
Couple things did happen. When Ali beats Liston in the rematch and he officially joins the Nation and changes his name, it's been well documented, there was a push to sort of weed out folks that were in Ali's life who didn't fit the image the Nation wanted him to represent, right? Because, you know, they were promoting their specific teachings and ways of looking at the world, and he had a black Jew in his corner who was married to a white woman who drank all the time. That didn't exactly fit Elijah Muhammad's teachings.
Yeah.
So yes, there were some pushes for him to convert early on, and there were some pushes even maybe to get Angelo out and get a black trainer. Ali loved those guys, and Ali was kind of always his own boss to a large degree.
Right.
So there was some friction early on, but you know, Ali pretty much kept that original entourage. He didn't waver, although I think there was a little friction in the early days.
And there was a point where they were trying to sort of cut, they tried to cut Bundini off financially? Or they actually did? How did that work?
What was happening was Bundini was against some of the teachings of the Nation. He grew up in Harlem, so he knew the rhetoric. You know, he's married to a white woman at the time. He has a biracial son. He wasn't jiving with some of the stuff Elijah Muhammad was saying about white people being devils and that kind of stuff. And he would speak to Muhammad and sort of say negative things about those teachings. And there were folks who approached Bundini and say, look, you know, you're not gonna confuse the champ. You're not gonna, you know, disrespect the honorable Elijah Muhammad. And what happened was, after the second Liston fight, they didn't pay him because of some of the things he'd embarrassed the Nation in a couple different ways, and they withheld his money, and that created their first rift as friends. They had you know, about a year and a half of pretty bitter resentment toward each other.
Was he on an actual payroll, or was it more sort of just Ali's largesse when he had, like, did they have any sort of system to how this worked?
Yeah, listen, you're not going to believe this, but it worked the same way with Sugar Ray Robinson. Bundini wasn't much of a reader. I mean, he quit school when he was very, very young. So he could read and write, but on a very basic level. So he didn't sign contracts because he didn't believe in them. It was a handshake. So Sugar Ray would pay him after the fight, but they would shake hands on what he would be paid, and Sugar Ray would pay him. That worked for 7 years. So when he joined Ali, it was the same thing. Well, he was owed a certain amount of money after the Liston fight, and because he had done some things that had disrespected the Nation, they didn't give him the money. There was no contract. And Bundini was very hurt by that. And so what he did was he took a hammer and he knocked the stones out of Ali's championship belt and tried to pawn them. And because of that incident, they exiled him for 7 fights. And Ali had given him the championship belt as a gift. When he beat Liston in the first fight, Ali gave the belt to Bundini. He said, "You're one of the reasons I did this," because that was Bundini's first fight with him. And Bundini had the belt. So when they didn't pay him, he went home and knocked the stones out of it, tried to pawn him. And of course, Ali was very upset over that. And it took a while for them to forgive each other. Let's say it that way.
So how did he make a living at time? I mean, I know that he lived on the margins a lot of the time, but did he have income, or would he just go long stretches of sort of street hustling, whatever he could come by?
Bundini was a hustler in the hip hop sense of the term. He could turn lemons into lemonade. Let's say it that way. He was a street guy, and but he was known in the boxing world. So don't forget, he had already worked with Sugar Ray for 7 years.
Right.
So when Muhammad Ali is about to fight Floyd Patterson for the first time, the great Customato calls Bundini and says, "Come join our corner. Help us beat Ali." And it was about to happen, but Floyd Patterson put the brakes on it because he thought Bundini was a spy. He thought it was a secret thing. And he believed that Ali and Bundini had faked the rift so that he could get inside his entourage and get, insider tips.
Like it.
So it didn't happen. But this is what lets you know it wasn't fake, is the next fight Ali fights a guy named George Chuvalo from Canada. And Chuvalo does the same thing. He gets Bundini to come help him fight Ali, and he does it. So that's how mad they were at each other. Bundini actually worked with Chuvalo against Ali.
But Bundini also was smart enough, or it's probably just his personality. He seemed really well liked, across the boxing world, which is not filled with people who love one another. He seemed to kind of float, there's that word again. He seemed pretty popular and could move in different circles, and people liked having him around.
Let me tell you, everyone I've interviewed for this book, and nobody said no to me. Everyone I talked to loved him. They didn't like him. They loved him. And even some of the people who I didn't get to interview before the book was finished, and now I'm getting to talk to and press for the book, they're like, "Oh, I wish you would have interviewed me. I've got all these Bundini stories." And he just won you over. He was funny. He was like Ali. He was generous. He wasn't materialistic. If he had $10, he gave 5 of it away to his buddies. He was just a great guy. And I do think he made more friends than enemies. And of course, Ali always brought him back.
Well, I also too is Ali was gregarious and popular, but after hours, he had his ladies, but he wasn't the life of the party guy because he didn't go out in the same way. I mean, I wonder if Bundini also charmed writers at the bar with Bert Sugar. You picture Bert Sugar sitting there. Bundini was that guy for Ali's entourage, which is a great.
Let me tell you something. I'm not going to name any names, but I talked to some boxing people today doing press for the book, and they told me some Bert Sugar Bundini stories. Those guys like to drink and they like to have a good time. Those two were thick, they were tight. Bundini loved writers. He was friends with James Baldwin, who's one of my heroes.
Yeah.
He was friends with Baldwin, and he was also friends with George Plimpton, which has been well documented. Plimpton always wrote about him. Those two loved to have a good time together. Yeah, musicians loved him, writers loved him. He was pretty well liked in boxing.
And did he actually have any enemies? Did he make? I mean, he made problems for himself, but did he make problems anywhere else, or was it the book seemed like a relatively charmed life for somebody who had a ton of problems?
Let me tell you this. When I'm interviewing George Foreman for the book, I call George and I'm thinking, this may be someone who didn't like Bundini, because that's a low point in George's career.
Yeah.
Ali, a fight he probably should have won. And you think about the fact that Bundini was sort of in Ali's corner, being his mouthpiece, and I thought George is going to be the first guy I interview who doesn't like him. That was my guess, and wrong again. They had been buddies 4 years prior to the Rumble in the Jungle. George had fought on the undercard. I believe it was Joe Frazier and Jimmy Ellis, and had met Bundini in Madison Square Garden, and they had struck up a friendship, and they loved each other. George, to a certain degree, was hurt having to go against Bundini. So, I mean, everybody liked him, even George Foreman.
I mean, it seemed like Bundini was also sort of one of the few who was like, maybe we should dial down the Joe Frazier stereotyping. This is a guy that, he's part of our world too. And
let me tell you something. He was very against the gorilla in Manila and all that stuff. It really, really bothered him. And Now, his son was very honest with me. Bundini was a big part of torturing Sonny Liston. He came up with a lot of that stuff with Bundini. So yes, he could be cruel too, but he felt bad for Joe. And if you go back and look up all of Bundini's quotes on Frazier, he always said Ali wouldn't have been great without him. It was his nemesis, the guy he couldn't quite really dominate. And Bundini did like Frazier, and he didn't like the way Ali taunted him. But his son said it to me this way: Frazier brought out something different than Ali. These are two guys who really were, I'm not even sure boxing has rivals like this anymore. I mean, they were bitter rivals. And maybe at the beginning for Ali, it was just playful, but it was more than that as the years went by. And Bundini wasn't a big fan of that stuff, although he couldn't control the champ.
No.
Especially when it came to Frazier.
And it seems like even in the Rumble in the Jungle, I guess, would be the best example, that Bundini, which a lot of times nobody in the boxing world gets, is like, this is a brutal sport that, like, we should remember what we're doing kind of to ourselves. And
right.
Especially in the, pre-CTE stuff, like in the 70s, that nobody, Cosell's just calling fights, but it did seem like Bundini had some little insight into, like, this is really brutal, and we should remember that the two guys in the ring are sacrificing themselves for us.
Yeah, and you know what? It's funny because Bundini had a really unique insight into what it meant to be a fighter, because you got to remember, a lot of top-level trainers, and you probably know this, or boxing insiders know this, the top guys, they only come in for the last couple weeks. Like, they come in and they work on the game plan, and then boom, they go to the fight. Bundini was there every day of training camp. I mean, during the mundane hours where it's road work and chopping wood and hitting the speed bag and the heavy bag, he shadowed Ali and Sugar Ray through all of the mundane routine stuff. Like, the life of a fighter is so monotonous. And Bundini was there to keep it from being monotonous. So he knew, and his phrase was, everyone knows, but everyone sees, but only a few know. And that meant a lot of people don't really know what it takes to have that championship belt around your waist. They see the fight, but there's so much pain and suffering and dedication that goes into it before you even get there. And I do think that's part of the reason he didn't like to see Frazier treated that way. Is he knew these guys were supreme athletes and putting their body through a lot of punishment.
I got the sense too, he had an idea of, like, when a coach gets himself thrown out of the game, sort of draw attention away. Like, he seemed to also kind of know, like, I should take the focus away today because Ali's in a bad mood or whatever. Let me dial it up a little bit more, and I'll get everybody over at my table because I'm funny. And he seemed to have a sense of how to play the crowds.
I think this is one of the lines I wrote in the book, is that Bundini could read people like we read books. He knew when you're having a down day. He knew when you were up, and he knew when you could lay off a little bit. He did. He had a real good sense of Ali and probably Sugar Ray Robinson. He knew about when to pour it on and when it was an emergency. And really, one of the biggest endorsements you could possibly get is that, Ali's brother Rahman recently released a book. And in that book, Rahman said Ali would probably have 4 more losses, maybe even more, if it wasn't for Bundini pulling him out of tough fights. One of those being the Thrilla in Manila, the third Ali-Frazier fight. He was ready to quit. Ali was just as ready to quit as Frazier was at the end. Bundini wouldn't like to quit.
I mean, that's the thing. He was like, I see what it's doing, but also we're not stopping now. We've come too far.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe in the Larry Holmes fight, he was a little blinded by his love for the champ. He kept screaming, one more round, because he just couldn't believe it was over. But I think that had to do with those guys kind of being at the end of the road. And, Bundini knew if this fight keeps going this way, Ali's never going to be the same. He's never going to fight again. It was hard thing to come to terms with.
I want to get a couple of stories that aren't in the book. Two good stories. But first, I do think we should point this out because it might be a lot of people's point of reference. It certainly was one of mine. Is the movie Ali. Jamie Foxx plays Bundini Brown.
Yeah.
Fun performance.
Great actor.
And, a solid movie, I'd say. I don't think it's a masterpiece, but it does what it does. However, they throw Bundini under the bus for not really well-established reasons. There's 2 things that aren't true, neither of which needed to be in there, but just tell us what those two things are and what, why that was in the movie, if you have any thoughts on that.
When I was approached about doing this book by Hamilcar Publications, Kyle Serafine, who's one of their editors, had written a blog about Bundini being the greatest hype man. And the blog got a lot of hits, and they realized, hey, there may be a market for a Bundini book. So when they approached me about doing it, I'd watched that Ali movie and felt, Patrick, about the same way you did. It was okay. Jamie Foxx is a fantastic, talented, artist, but I didn't know that stuff wasn't true either. So I went into it just like you, just thinking like, well, I assume that's true. It's not, and it's provably not true. Here's the thing. And there's a dramatic scene in the movie where Ali is watching the Joe Frazier, Jimmy Ellis fight, I believe it is. And Howard Bingham says to him, "You better watch out. I saw Bundini. He's not doing good. Better get your belt back. He's in bad shape." So Ali goes to Harlem, and Bundini is strung out on heroin in a beat down hotel room. And he had sold the belt for heroin money.
Which he had stolen, right? The movie says he stole it,
He had
right?
stole it. He had stole it from Ali and wouldn't give it back. I mean, first of all, I talked to Kalia, Ali's wife at the time. Her name was Belinda at that point. Ali had given him the belt, and it was never stolen, and Ali didn't want it back. Ali was super not materialistic. He gave him the belt as a gift. So it wasn't stolen. And two, there was never a hotel encounter. Bundini was never on heroin. He was definitely an alcoholic, and he definitely could be wild, but he wasn't a,
which is so weird, because why can't he just be a washed out drunk? Like, that's the part I don't get.
Bundini's son said that to me. He said if they had just made him out to be a drunk, then I would have at least kind of understood that it's well known he was an alcoholic. That's okay. But let's be honest, like, they didn't need to take it that far. And the reason
it adds literally nothing to the movie. Also, why not just have him say, I sold the belt because the nation isn't paying me. Like, one sentence makes it way more accurate, and I just don't get the.
Well, I think it's pretty simple to see the reason. I mean, if you tell the real story, then your audience is a little divided as to who is the bad guy.
I guess.
To a degree. No, I mean, there's no doubt when he took the hammer and beat the stones out of the belt, he did that with anger in his heart. He was mad at the champ. But to tell your friend who is married to a white woman and has a biracial child that, I can't have you around because of who you are, that would hurt if your friend did that to you, and you would be mad. And it makes it a little divided as to who did the not so nice.
And if he was a heroin user, it would make sense. That's why he went no.
So you make him a heroin user, and then you could go, oh man, look how
you're the
right. Take it back.
Anybody can be a drunk. It takes a special person to.
And look, I'm not letting Bundini off the hook. We deal with his demons in this book.
Yeah.
He did a malicious thing to the belt. He did that on purpose to hurt Ali, and Ali was forgiving and taking him back. Ali was a very forgiving person, and he fired Bundini. Everyone I talked to gave me a different story, but 12 times, 8 times, 15. Everyone you talked to had a different number. Ali fired him frequently, and he always brought him back. And it was a true friendship. They got through the issue with the belt. But the movie really, really threw a lot of dirt on Bundini's name. And I felt bad for the family because they were not involved in the making of that movie. Like a lot of people weren't involved in the making of that movie. And they went to the theater excited to see Jamie Foxx play their family member.
Yeah, I guess it was just, right. I didn't know that. I mean, I assumed the heroin. I didn't really remember the scene until I read your book, and then I rewatched the movie, and I assumed, well, that had to be somewhat accurate. It was just, I don't know. It just left a bad taste in my mouth. Why do that to him?
Look, here's the whole timeline. In the movie, the belt gets sold while Ali's in exile. So what it looks like is Bundini's not getting Ali money, so he sells the belt, That's not when it happened. It happened after the Liston fight, way before exile, and it happened for a different reason. So the heroine gives a reason. It gives a...
Right, of course. I'll just say this. If you've never seen it, dig up Only in America, which is a crazy movie, and you get to see Bernie Mac play Bundini.
Yeah, which is pretty wild. I love Bernie Mac, but maybe not the best Bundini impression.
But he doesn't even look like it. Like,
not at all.
They didn't even try. Bundini has a very distinct haircut that
Yeah, you could have mocked that easily. You would think.
Yeah,
Right?
there's like,
Jamie Foxx
got
did
Bernie
that.
Mac. Yeah, for one day. We can have him for one day. So,
Mhm.
all right, give us a couple of good stories that didn't make the book, because everyone's watching this is going to buy the book, so they're going to.
Yeah, let me tell you, the sort of the things that I keep hearing, that that I couldn't necessarily fit every family story in the book. I couldn't let in every boxing story in the book. The things I always hear that I wish I could have put these in are the human stories about the guys who met him for one day.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the stories, this is in there, but it's going to get me to my next story. There was a guy at Fighter 7 who came up to Bundini. That was Ali's training camp in Deer Lake, Pennsylvania. And he says, "Hey, I love your Float Like a Butterfly t-shirt. Where can I get one?" And Bundini just takes it off his back and gives it to him. He's seriously that kind of guy. And, the more people I talk to who had a chance to meet him, they tell me the same story over and over again about how generous he was with his time. He loved to just sit down and talk with people. And I think Ali did that to a degree too. Where he would go have a beer with a complete stranger. And, he would sort of take you under his wing like that. He was such an emotional, friendly, sort of free spirit kind of guy. And he was also always pushing boundaries, going in places he shouldn't be at the time. When it came to, segregated restaurants and stuff like that in the South, he would march right in. He didn't care one bit. And he would read the sign knowing that it said, whites only or whatever. And he would walk in anyways. And sometimes he would be able to talk his way in, and he would get to eat. Sometimes, they would kick him out. But, he was just that kind of guy where, you almost had to love him. You know what I mean? He was always pushing boundaries. He was always the life of the party, like you said earlier. So talking to folks who really aren't, I got to talk to Larry Holmes and Foreman and all these guys. But sometimes some of the folks I interviewed who just met him once, they were just as fun to interview because they would have these kind of quick little stories of Bundini that helped shape the character for me a little bit.
And they all proved out who he was. It seems like if everybody liked him, like it didn't seem like through the research you're like, oh, I have to rethink the whole thing, because I mean he does seem to be what you.
Well, and here's the thing is, everyone that I interviewed they would act like they had a bombshell for me. They would say, "Oh, I've got something. You got to use this in your book." He had this special handshake that he would do, where he would stick out his pinky, and he would say, "Give me the little ones, because the big ones can take care of themselves." And that was his whole shorty philosophy. Well, everybody I interviewed told me that like I hadn't heard it, and I had to pretend like I didn't know that already. I think probably 20 or 30 different people said, "Oh, I've got one for you. He had this special handshake he did with me." And he did it with everybody. I mean, these are people who are boxing elites and also regular guys off the street. He did that with everybody. Give me the little ones, because the big ones can take care of themselves.
That's fantastic. I have something I want to ask you. So we don't have a question at the moment, so there's something I want to ask you after. But let's run the clip first, so you guys can see Bundini and Ali together in action.
Yeah, let's do it.
Do we have sound?
You're not hearing the sound?
I do not hear any sound.
Let's put it back on. I'm so sorry.
No
That's
problem.
weird. Having tested this before that. Let's try it now. Come on, audio. You can do it.
Float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. Rumble, young man, rumble. Think we crazy. Let them keep thinking. Listen, they crazy. Let them keep thinking it. Listen, they crazy. We are crazy. Ladies and gentlemen, we are being attacked by highway bandits. They are now approaching us on their horses. What do you say, stewardess? You mean the plane is going to crash? Say a prayer, recite a Bible verse. Just do something religious. I'll take up a collection.
I think we should point out that Ali had the seersucker on. There's the full Louisville right there. That's I like that. So what I wanted to ask you is, it's been another banner week in these here United States of America. Just brutal. And all these athletes, particularly the NBA, leading the charge, are basically walking off the job. They're striking in the same way that we probably haven't seen since Ali in '68. And just, what do you think of the comparisons between the eras? Do you see some of the echoes of that now? And what did Bundini think of those, of Ali's decision to basically tell the government to go fuck themselves?
Let me tell you, man, it was so crazy that writing this book at this time period, it felt like I was writing about today in some ways. And I mean that, like, when I was researching Sanford, well, that's where Trayvon Martin's murder happened, in Sanford.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I'm researching the KKK and racism and segregation in Sanford during Bundini's life, and then it hits me, that's where the Trayvon Martin murder happened. You know, I'm also thinking, you know, that's where Jackie Robinson was. You know, and he was even in the minor leagues in Sanford. He was getting harassed by the locals. This book does feel like a book that speaks to the current moment in a lot of ways, and that was not my intention going into it. But much of the book follows Ali and Bundini as they go through the sort of the racial tensions of the time when America was very divided, and we had the Vietnam War, and we had a lot of racial strife in America through Bundini's life. His famous phrase was, "Blue eyes and brown eyes see grass green," and his philosophy was, and it's been well written about in other Ali books, Bundini looked at sort of the human race as being one race. And, you know, one of his favorite sayings that he would say to people is, there's good people and bad people, and it doesn't take you long to figure out who's who. And he was very much someone who spoke like a rhetoric of peace. And he wanted, I mean, for him, it didn't matter what background you were from, or, you know, if you were white, black, whatever. He was someone who loved people. And Ali, of course, is the athlete activist, maybe ever. You know, Kaepernick feels very much like an Ali figure today. I mean, a lot of these folks who are saying disparaging things about Kaepernick, I know what they would have said about Ali. They would have said the same thing.
And he became your avuncular, you know, everyone's favorite uncle at one point. And, you know, it's the same thing they've done to Martin Luther King, but I mean, that was 68.
Let me tell you something. In one line in the book, I had written that Ali has been turned into a Hallmark ornament. And one of the editors, like, you sure you want to keep that in? I said, literally, I have him on my Christmas tree. He's a Hallmark ornament. Literally on my Christmas tree. The most famous Muslim athlete ever, maybe. Yeah, we've sanitized Ali's legacy. He was a radical vehicle for change. He gave a lot of Black people pride at a time where, you know, some of the professors and writers I talked to said, you know, in their grandfather's day, if they called you Black, that was fighting words. If you said that to another Black man, two Black men. And Ali gave people pride in being Black. Just like, you know, the Panthers coming through and all these other social movements gave people pride and gave people hope for change. Ali is the athlete ever. You know, he's the beginning of all the stuff we're seeing right now in the NBA and with Kaepernick. Bundini was with him thick and thin throughout exile, and he was with him the day he turned himself in with the, you know, draft evasion charges. Bundini wasn't a political activist in the same way Ali was. It was sort of on the pulpit, but he was there going through it with him. Not only did he kick it in his own life.
Bundini had a little bit of the sort of hippie mysticism to him.
Oh,
also.
yeah.
Very fitting of the time. Like, he had some of the
he was very much had the hippie vibe, no doubt about it, more so than Ali did. And Bundini, his son compared him to someone who sort of has like traditionally Native American views, where sort of like God was this mystic presence in his life. And that makes sense to me, knowing a little bit about him. I could see that.
And you know, he can enjoy the peyote in a way that Muhammad Ali never.
You know, Ali didn't drink. Ali did not drink.
I know he was square. He was square, and he you know, whatever the Nation of Islam, he believed in his Muslim beliefs, but also he seemed to like the order of he seemed to like having a structure that was very ordered, separate from his religious beliefs.
Sure, you got to think Ali was someone who, I mean, let's be honest, he grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, and it was tough. I grew up not far from there, and it was tough for Black folks in those days. And here comes the Nation of Islam, dressed nice, speaking powerfully, and fighting oppression. He very much looked at that with romantic eyes. He wanted to be that kind of man. And he liked the order. He liked the structure. He liked the teaching spoke to him in a powerful way. Deeply spiritual guy, just like Bundini. They just had different paths.
Do you think that Ali, on some level, liked having Bundini around because he got to witness some things that maybe some ideas about the world crossed his mind, or something like, I'd like to be this free spirit on certain days? Like, did Bundini kind of give him anything that perhaps he wanted but couldn't do once he became?
Some of the writers who I talked to, some went on record, some didn't want to go on record, but some said to me that Ali kind of had a little bit of a complex. So he grew up in kind of a country boy. Mm-hmm. And, you know, most of the great fighters at the time came from these big urban places like New York City or LA or wherever. And Ali wasn't necessarily a street dude. He grew up in a sort of middle-class family in Louisville. You know, he didn't have that sort of street persona. And some of the people I talked to felt like Bundini gave him a little extra dose of that. That kind of vibe. I don't know if that's the case or not. Who knows? But I think he liked him because of the way he made him feel. You know, my dad was a trainer, and I know what it feels like on the day you don't feel like doing road work, getting up at 5 a.m. and running 5 miles. You got the right person, get you out of bed, get you hyped, make you get motivated. You like that feeling. It's addictive. You want someone to make you feel that way. And Ali liked feeling like the greatest. And from the minute he opened his eyes in the morning, there was Bundini Brown rhyming to him and hyping him up to be great every single day. I think he brought him around for that reason too. Not that he just wanted that street persona. I think it was that, but I think it's also the motivation helped in a sport like boxing, where you got to be motivated every time you get in the ring. I mean,
he also had what I think is really interesting is, you know, sort of the platonic version of love. Like, Muhammad Ali had way more fear, I think, than people realize. And Bundini was one guy who was like, it's okay to be afraid. Like, he really had that 70s kind of vibe. They gave it to him, yeah.
And he said, and he told him that the great Sugar Ray Robinson had taught him that the greatest champions can accept their fear. They can accept it. And, you know, Customato had a similar philosophy with Mike Tyson, where he would say, the difference between a hero and a coward, there is no difference. It's what one does and what the other one doesn't do that separates how you get defined as a hero or a coward. They both feel fear. They both are scared out of their mind, but one knows how to push through it and accept it. And Bundini, the same thing about crying. He would say to the champ, you know, that you got to be in tune with your emotion. The great Sugar Ray Robinson taught me that if you don't, you'll be consumed by your fear. You have to accept those moments where you have doubt. You have to still fight hard even when you doubt you can win. And that's part of the philosophy he gave to Ali.
We're coming to the end here. Let me ask you one question just about, as somebody who doesn't follow boxing like I did at one time in my life, are you still tied into the fight game? Do you follow it closely? Is it something with all the different belts and pay-per-views, and does it mean the same thing to you now that it did growing up?
I tell you, if there's two things I love about life beyond my wife and my son and my job, I love boxing with all my heart. And if there's a fight on, it could be the worst fight in the world and I'm watching it. Something bad's had to have happened to me for me to not watch a fight. I mean, I watched the worst fights in the world. Me and my dad, when we go to the Garden, we used to watch the very first fight of the night. There'd be like 50 people in the crowd. I love boxing with a passion. Hip hop and boxing are the two things that get me excited about life outside my family. I don't miss a fight. I'm pretty tuned in.
So who should we look at right now? What fighter to somebody like me is like, I need to find a guy. Who's the guy right now you think I should look at?
Well, I mean, I think pound for pound, the mythical pound for pound rankings, I think, are so biased, and there's really no such thing as pound for pound. It's just it's a debate piece for media. But the guy who is certainly the name in boxing right now is Saul Canelo Alvarez, the great Mexican fighter. He's on the pound for pound for a lot of people. He's a super talented fighter. His only loss is to Floyd Mayweather when he was, I think, 23. And he had a draw with Gennady Golovkin, who's a fantastic
Yeah. I do actually know
I
that.
feel like if you're looking for the most popular, flashy fighter in the game, Canelo's probably your guy. Who I kind of have a gut feeling might be the best fighter in boxing is Terrence Bud Crawford, undefeated fighter at welterweight. He's a WBO.
Terrence Bud Crawford.
Pretty amazing. I watched him at the Garden a couple years ago, and he was one of the few guys I've ever watched in person who was even more impressive. This blinding speed, can fight lefty, can fight right-handed, has a mean streak in him. He can box, but if you're hurt, he'll finish you off. Those two guys kind of, in my opinion, represent the height of boxing right now. They're the two best in the game. They're worth your money.
All right. Well, when and if we ever get back to the way life was lived, we can all we'll meet up at Jimmy's Corner.
So sad.
Rest in peace, Jimmy.
Rest in peace, Jimmy. Man, I was so sad to hear about that. I never met him, but I've been to his place. Good guy. They loved him, for sure.
When I first moved to New York, he was 20 some odd years ago. He would still be tending bar behind the stick at night.
I think he was there most of the time, pretty much.
He'd be there during the day as he got older. So unless you want to go day drinking, but he was a good man, and that's a great spot. And I hope it doesn't go away during this. Okay, I have a couple announcements as we're coming to it. Our next episode, 9/18, that's a Friday night. It's with comedian Mike Birbiglia and his poet wife, J-Hope Stein. That's a ticketed event. You have to buy the book. There will be not a lot of sports talk, but he's funny. And then on September 29th, if this is interest to anyone, the book is out now. It's kind of goofy doing these things because sometimes you talk to like you where the book just came out. So you're trying to get people interested in the book.
Sure.
So in a month, this book will have been out for a little while. It's called Wheels of Courage, and it's about how World War II veterans in wheelchairs started the sports disability movement. And that's going to be on 9/29. The author is David Davis. There is a great documentary. If you go on YouTube, you guys made a documentary about Bundini, 20 minutes long, and after watching it, you're going to want to get the book because the book is great, and he's a true American. It's like the fake Don King shit that he says is actually Bundini.
In some ways.
I mean, that's yes, he's a true American grifter, which gets you pretty far these days in America. But Bundini is not. He's a soulful dude, and if you've seen Ali, we already discussed that. But
you definitely want to check the documentary. It's 20 minutes. You can find it on YouTube. It's a guy named Patrick Green, who's a filmmaker out of LA, put this together to kind of create awareness of who the guy is. We wanted folks to know what they were getting into when they bought the book. It was a fabulous, fabulous documentary, and he did a great job of finding rare footage of Bundini.
Yeah, it's terrific. And the book is on sale at Greenlight,
Cool.
Which you should buy. Thank you, Doctor. You're our first doctor. Thank you.
Just Todd tonight. Just Todd.
Hip hop doctor.
Oh yeah, a doctor of hip hop is definitely the way to close out the evening. That was so informative and super super fascinating. I knew literally nothing about this before now, and I'm excited to read the book. It's sitting in a stack. Like is the joy of working at a bookstore. Patrick and Todd, always a delight. I also put the event details in if people want to register now for the Birbiglia and the Davis events later on, and we'll see you all soon. Thanks for a lovely evening, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Have a nice night. Bye-bye.
Be safe, everyone.
See ya.